Dawn came thin and cold across Arrow Bend, a pale sheet of light slipping through aspen that trembled like a whisper of rain. The corral woke with the scrape of hooves and the stink of wet leather. Dust lifted and hung a slow gold that made the men squint and spit. Nora Briggs stood at the fence in a dress the color of old wheat. The hem wore the red of the road. Her shawl sat square on her shoulders. She kept her hands still, though she wanted to rub the grit out of her palms where the skin had split. The ledger boy, Tate Wickers, leaned against a post with his boots crossed and a pencil balanced on one ear. "We are not a charity," he said, without looking at her. "Good," Nora said. "I'm not asking for charity. I can ride, I can mend fence, I can handle calves." A ripple of laughter slid along the stable wall. Huck freckled and sharp as a thorn. Moe's thick wrists in a cheerful meanness. Lyle with tobacco in his lip. Moe said she here to sit on the cattle or count them by the pound. Huck cupped a hand to his ear. "Hear that, boys, the herd is nervous already." Nora did not change her face. The air smelled like pine pitch and manure. A blue columbine leaned against the fence rail petals, wet with dawn stubborn in the trampled yard. "No one is lining up to marry a heavy widow," she said. "I am here to work." The laughter snagged and quit. A horse blew soft through its nose. From the far stall a man shifted and came into the light, his shadow long and thin on the dirt. He wore his hat low. Gray stubble roughened his jaw. His eyes were the color of a river before a storm. Eli Hart did not say a word at first. He let the room of men see his face. He looked at Nora the way a man reads sky, picking out what is wind and what is trouble. "She rides with me at first light," he said. His voice did not carry far. It did not need to. Tate opened the ledger. "Your name, then?" "Nora Briggs." The pencil scratched paper. Somewhere a spur ticked against a plank. A small sound. Clean. Eli moved away before anyone could look to him for more. Nora did not look to him at all. By the time the sun cleared the cottonwoods by the creek, the day had heated into work. They handed Nora a coil of barbed wire that bit and stuck no matter how she held it. No one walked her to the feed shed. No one showed her where the post-hole digger leaned. She found both after a long search heat in her ears and sweat running salt into her palms. The wire sang when she pulled it tight, a high, angry sound that shook out through her elbows. Huck watched her set a post and smirked. "You plan to woo the ground or just stand there admiring it?" Nora steadied her breath. She sunk the auger blade and twisted until her shoulders burned. Dust rose and settled on the back of her neck, where hair had come loose. The columbine at the fence had a bee in it, now legs fat with yellow, unbothered by voices. By mid-morning she had a blister the size of a nickel on her right hand and smaller ones hiding under the callus of the left. She wrapped them with a strip torn from her slip. The cloth went dark and slick. No one saw Eli circle to the horses. He stooped by the roan gelding they had given. Nora checked the frog of each hoof with a quick thumb, tightened the front cinch. 2 notches loosened the back one just a breath. He tied a clean canteen beside the saddle horn and left a coil of rope that had already been weighted and trained to fall true. He spoke to the horse once under his breath. Salt flicked an ear and settled. In the afternoon she found her tack resting in a cool square of shade under an aspen. The leather had been oiled and rubbed until it looked like wet coffee. Her name was cut into the strap letters, tidy and shallow. She did not say anything. The tree made a silver sound when the wind worked the leaves. It sounded like rain, though the sky was clean and bright. They drove a stray heifer from a wash that same day. Huck thought it would be funny to tie Nora's rein short with a tricky knot while she had her head down under a branch. She caught the turn with her fingers, felt the wrongness of it, and fixed it in 3 motions. He watched the quick intelligence of her hands and looked away like a boy who had been seen. Eli sat his horse at a remove. He did not call across the wash. He did not tell the boys to shut their mouths. He watched Nora bring the heifer up out of the slot of land patient with the way she used her legs and the soft clucks of her tongue. When she glanced up, their eyes found and held for a small beat. His chin tipped once, almost nothing, a note sent and received. By evening, the wind turned uphill and carried the smell of beans from the cookhouse. The sun dropped behind the red ridge and lit the aspen from underneath, so the leaves glowed lime green as if they were made of glass. Nora took her place with the hands by the long plank table. She ate slow. She kept her back straight. Huck told a story about a steer that kicked a man into next week, and everyone laughed too loud. When she stood to leave, her legs worked like wood. At the bunkhouse, she found her boots waiting by the fire ring. Someone had cleaned them and set them to dry. Inside each tongue, a thin strip of soft leather had been stitched by hand. The stitches were small and tight in a way a woman might do for a child or a man might do for a wound he would not show. Nora ran her finger over the seam and felt the give of it. She looked toward the shadow where the sharpening stone sat. Eli Hart was a shape there bent over a blade that caught orange from the coals. "Boots are not made to punish the ones who walk," he said. He did not look up. Nora set the boots down and let the heat work into the toes. She sat on the step with her knees, raised her hands on her shins. The air was cool now and smelled like damp ash and horse, and the faint sugar of coffee gone cold. A moth found the flame and turned to nothing. The men finished their tobacco and drifted off to cards. No one asked her to join. She did not go in. Later she learned to tie the bosul knots the way Eli preferred reins that speak more than they drag. He showed her with his own rope careful hands on careful leather. He said, "Ask, do not command." She nodded. The rope warmed under her fingers and made a low rub against her palm. The skin there was new and tender. She could feel the beat of her blood in each finger. Every so often the iron of his spur caught the beam and made that bright, clean sound. Night settled over Adobe Springs and the flats beyond. The heat bled off the ground and left a thin shine like a memory of water. Cattle shifted in the lower pasture, and their bodies moved like boulders in a slow brown river. Somewhere in town a piano fought for tune inside a door that would not shut. "Where do you want me at first light?" Nora asked. Eli pulled the knot gently and let the reins fall straight to prove the braid. "North fence. The washouts took half of it. We will ride the line." She stood. The sky was purple at the edges now. A star pricked open over the ridge, bright and cold. Nora rubbed her palms against her skirt and felt the sting that warned of blisters broken and skin trying to knit. She looked past the corrals to the upthrust of land that cut the horizon a black tooth against the last light. The sound came from there, long and thin at first, then another voice lower, then a third. The hair rose along her neck. The cattle bunched and breathed hard. Salt lifted his head and fixed on the dark with ears forward, Huck said from the doorway, trying for swagger and missing coyotes. Eli listened without moving. The aspen leaves worked against one another in soft applause. His eyes went to the ridge and stayed. "Wolves," he said. "They are closer tonight." The night held still as if it had taken a breath and refused to let it go. The wolves did not sing again before dawn. They left a pressure in the dark that stayed in Nora's ribs when the light came thin and silver across the flats. Eli was already in the yard. His hat brim cut a clean line. Salt tossed his head and set the bit with a click. The aspen along the ditch flickered and made that soft, wet sound, though the sky was bare. "North fence," Eli said. Nora swung up. The new canteen knocked the saddle horn once and stilled. The reins lay warm as bread across her fingers. He set his horse forward. She followed. Their shadows stretched black and long ahead of them on the ground that still held night. They rode through grass that came to the stirrups and fell away in quiet waves. Cattle moved slow in the lower swale heads, down tails flicking. The smell of them was clean and animal and bright with dust. Eli kept his eyes on the land. He did not speak unless he needed a word to be set in place. At the break of a dry wash, he drew up and lifted the bosul on Salt's face to show her the lay of the knot. He worked it with 2 fingers. The rawhide whispered. "Hands first," he said. "Ask, do not command." Nora rested her palm on the horse's cheek and felt the heat through hair and skin. She rethreaded the loop the way he had, slow and exact. Her fingers found the rhythm of the braid and the give at each turn. The little pressure told Salt what she wanted before the strap did. It felt like learning a new alphabet made of touch. "Good," Eli said. They pushed along the fence line. Here the posts were sound, sunk deep caps greased against rain that had not yet come. There the wire had been bowed by water and slapped loose by something heavy with a mind to go through. They reset what they could and tied off tails with pigging string. Nora lifted and pulled and let her legs do the work, keeping her spine lined. Sweat went into her eyes. She blinked it away. By noon the light had gone white. A buzzard turned above the ridge and held a circle. The cattle bunched without obvious reason, turning their bodies shoulder to shoulder in a shape like a storm cloud. Salt pricked both ears toward the far draws. Nora reached for the coil of rope that sat ready at her knee. A fly landed on her neck and bit. She did not swat it. Eli rose out of his saddle and stood in the stirrups to see above the brush. He settled back with no comment. The wind came lightly from the north, cool as creek water. The horses took it in with wide nostrils. The first sound was small, a yip that did not belong to a coyote. It had a roundness in it and a distance that made the hair along Nora's forearms lift. The second sound agreed with the first. The third was lower and pulled from the belly. The cattle shifted, an entire acre of muscle ready to run. They came in twos low through the rabbit-brush yellow eyes flat under the glare. The lead wolf showed the long ribs of a winter not quite done with him. He stepped into the open and frowned in a way that made Nora think of a man trying to remember a thing he had set down. Eli's rifle was already out of its scabbard. He had not lifted it. Nora slid to the ground. Her skirt took red dust at the knee. She felt for the pistol tucked under cloth where it rode warm against her thigh. Thomas had insisted she learn to shoot after the first calf went missing. Her hand did not tremble. She marked the ground a hand's width left of the wolf's muzzle, a safe place where a shot could crack and make a point without a body to carry it. She fired once into dirt. The sound went up and hit the cliff and came back. Dust jumped. The wolf startled and blinked and decided the moment did not belong to him. He backed a step and another. The rest melted back into brush, as if a hand had skimmed over their backs and flattened them into the earth. Nora stood with smoke in her nose and held the gun straight down until her ears stopped ringing. She holstered it and looked up. Eli had not moved much. He was looking at her as if she were a word he had heard before, but never in this voice. He gave the smallest nod. Not a thank you, not praise. Just a small truth shared between two people who had seen a thing and would not make a meal of it. They took the herd onto a scratch of meadow where a creek knuckled out of rock and ran clear across gravel. They let the cattle water until their sides filled and showed wet like oiled leather. Eli set a fire from juniper he had cut with his pocket saw. The smoke carried a sharp sweetness that cleaned the air of animal and gunpowder. He boiled coffee so dark it looked like river bottom and handed her a tin cup. She ate a biscuit she had wrapped in cloth and broke it in half across her knee, the crumb fine and clean. She pushed the larger piece across to him without comment. He took it and chewed eyes on the line where the grass met stone. After a while, he drew a small thing from his coat. It was a bird carved from juniper body rough wings only suggested. The grain ran along its back in lines as tight as stitches. He turned it in his palm, not showing it, not hiding it. "I made it in a winter that would not end," he said. "Hands do better with work." Nora looked at the bird and then at his fingers. His knuckles were scarred in a way that spoke about ropes and rifles and days without rest. She touched one wing with the tip of a nail and felt the sap in the wood. Her own hands were swollen and lined with salt. She took a strip of fabric from her pocket, the one she had used on blisters, and shook it clean. He reached into his coat again and brought out a white handkerchief, edges stitched by a careful hand. The corner read R.H. in a thread the color of tea. "My ma did not care for blood," he said. "Keep it." Nora pressed it to the inside of her palm, where the skin had opened that morning when a barb bit too deep. The cloth took the stain and stayed soft. It smelled faintly of cedar. She folded it once and tucked it into the bodice of her dress, where it lay cool as a coin. When they broke camp, she went to kick dirt over the fire and saw something catch on a rock in the current. It was a square of cedar thin as a playing card the surface scorched. 2 letters had been burned into it with a hot nail, C and M. The wood had swelled with water and still held the mark dark as tar. She fished it out and let the creek run off it in threads. Eli watched her hand and the wood both. "Could be nothing," he said. "Could be something she said?" He took it and slid it under his saddle strings without speaking more. They moved the herd slow along the notch of land where the creek had cut. A hawk rode the heating air and made no sound. In the afternoon, they set the cattle on better grass and turned for town. Heat had lifted resin from the pines and made the air taste of it. Adobe Springs came up with its low roofs and a church spire that leaned just enough to look thoughtful. A piano hit a sour note somewhere, and a door banged twice in a row and gave up. The general store had flour stacked in white towers behind clean glass. The porch boards ran deep with the traffic of boots. Nora stepped inside for a sack of beans and a paper twist of salt. The air was cool. The smell of coffee and molasses mixtures held to the rafters. 2 women stood behind a barrel of nails. Their voices did not carry far and did not need to. "She has him tied to her apron," one said. "Not 30 and twice a widow if you count a ranch bled," the other said. Nora kept her face as if she had not heard. She held the beans tight until the cloth cut her fingers. At the counter, a box of matches sat open where boys could see them. 2 of those boys leaned close and dared one another. A sulfur head hissed and sparked. The clerk slapped the boy's hand without looking up and said nothing. Beneath the braid of garlic hanging by the window stood Delamore in a dress the color of clean wood. Her hair was white and tied close to her head. She saw Nora without staring and gave the smallest nod, a thing like a hand placed on a shoulder in a dark room. Nora paid and carried the bag in the crook of her arm and left the store with her back straight and her mouth dry. Outside, the heat had leaned down. The aspen by the trough trembled and made their soft sound. It felt wrong under a sky so stark. Sheriff Pike stood with his boot on a step and a cup of coffee that had given up being hot. He tipped the cup instead of his hat. Eli tied their horses on the far rail and said nothing to any of them. They rode out of town in a line as simple as a string pulled tight. Dust rose under Salt's hooves and drifted back and laid itself down on the road behind them. A dog barked twice and lay down again. A woman shook a rug and beat dust into light and made a pattern on the ground that disappeared when the sun moved. By the time the ranch fence came into view, the light had gone from yellow to the color of raw copper. The cattle in the home pasture had found shade. A buzz of flies pulled from the manure in a steady cord. Nora felt tired in the way that shows up only when a person steps close to home. She breathed and let the breath out slow. The handkerchief at her chest had warmed with her skin and seemed to rest there as if it had always belonged. They passed the lower gate. The top rail held a scrap of something bright and wrong against the wood. Nora reined in and reached. Her fingers came back with a piece of red cloth torn clean. It had been pinned to the fence post with a bent spur, the rowel twisted and frozen. Eli sat his horse and looked at the cloth without speaking. Huck came up behind them and stopped. He looked from the spur to the red and then to Eli. He swallowed and said nothing. The evening air went quiet in a way that narrowed the world to 3 people, a fence post, and a bright red scrap darkening where her thumb pressed it. The aspen leaves whispered as if rain had started far away and was taking its time to arrive. Nora held the red scrap between finger and thumb until the dye bled into the sweat of her skin. The bent spur was cold, where it bit the post rowel frozen at a strange angle like a mouth half shut. Huck shifted his weight and kept his eyes on the dirt. "Pull it," Eli said. Nora pried the spur free. The wood released with a dry sigh. She wrapped the cloth around the metal once and slid both into her pocket. The air tasted of resin and dust. The aspen by the ditch worked its leaves and made that soft, wet music that had no water in it. They finished the chores without chatter. Nora raked the yard where the cattle had churned the ground to powder and almost enjoyed the ache that settled across her back. Eli moved along the corrals checking latches as if they could fail by mood alone. When the light thinned to copper, he came to where she stood by the gate. "Early," he said, "ride before the heat." She knew where he meant without asking. Coyote Ridge held the bone-white markers of the folks this country took first and hardest. She nodded. He stepped back and the conversation ended there. They were on the trail while the sky was still the color of pewter. Salt climbed easy, sure, on the narrow switchbacks. The ridge rose in stacked plates. Aspen clung to seams in the rock and seemed to tremble from the inside out. Columbine showed where there was a thumb of soil to take a root blue and white like a spill of sky. At the top, wind moved through the grass in a way that felt like someone walking past with purpose. Nora dismounted and put her hand flat to a marker that had been cut from a plank and set at a slant. The knifework was plain. Jonah Briggs. The J had been restarted once the first mark struck wrong, then cut over and corrected. She took a breath that did not fill her. Her dress had gathered burrs at the hem. She brushed them off and then brushed dirt from the base of the board with the side of her sleeve until the grain showed clean. "I am not what dresses are cut for," she said. Her voice sounded like it had been left in a cupboard and brought out with care. "I am tired in ways that do not take a nap. I know fence and rope and fire. That is what I have." She did not look to see if Eli heard. She knew he did. The wind flattened her hair against her neck and let it go again. The ridge carried a smell of sun on rock. Far off, a hawk called once as if to count the living. Eli knelt and set the bent spur in the grass at the foot of the board. He pressed it into the earth with his thumb so the rowel stood like a small star. From the pocket of his coat he took the little bird he had been carving in the evenings. Its wings were still only half suggested. He found the seam between 2 stones and fit the bird there as if it had been waiting for a nest. "I'm not asking for a hand," he said. "I'm asking for your shadow to keep even with mine." Nora kept still. A small piece inside her that had been braced for years loosened and did not leave. She touched the top edge of the plank where the sun had silvered it and let her fingers rest until the heat of the wood came up into them. She did not cry. The handkerchief with the stitched letters rode warm at her breast. She felt the corner where a thin old knot raised the fabric and knew the feel of it by heart already. They stood a while with nothing more said than was needed. When they turned to go, Nora looked back once. 2 sets of prints ran side by side across the skin of the ridge, deep where the ground gave, and shallower where it held firm. The wind took the edges of the prints and softened them, but could not erase them at once. They had not cleared the slope when a stain of smoke rose where no cooking fire should be. It did not smear or thin like a campfire. It climbed and held itself with anger. Salt felt Nora's legs tighten and snorted. Eli put his horse down the switchback in a run that kept control without wasting it. By the time they hit the flats, the air had the taste of grease and scorched feed. A shot cracked from the yard and snapped a splinter off the barn door. The herd bawled in the lower field, crowding churning dust into a blind wall. Cobra Mesa riders came in from the cottonwood line, their scarves low over Jaws hats, yanked. Red Rafe Malloy sat tall with a red bandana tied so tight his cheeks puffed. He laughed and threw a bottle at the feed shed. It broke and chased its own fire down the rough boards. The flame took what it was given and asked for more. Nora did not shout. She put Salt between her and the men and slid to the ground. Her skirt grabbed at her knees. She drew the pistol from under cloth and did not waste breath on words. Rafe turned as if to measure who was left to frighten and met the round she sent into the place where shoulder meets chest. The kick of the gun went up her arm and set her teeth. Rafe spun off his horse and hit the yard with a sound that cut the laughter off and made it ugly. His horse bolted. One of his men pulled rein too hard and sawed the mouth of his own mount. The animal reared and fell backward. The rider scrambled clear and came up with dirt on his tongue. Eli took a man out of the saddle with one shot and then ran for the burning shed. He disappeared in smoke and came back with a pitchfork and a tarp that threw sparks when it moved. He beat the flames at the bottom edge of the wall. Another rider swung wide of the mess and came in behind, picked up a length of fallen rail and drove it into Eli's temple like a bat. Wood split. Eli went down quiet in a way that scared Nora worse than shouting. The man who had swung the rail raised a pistol and walked to where Eli lay. Nora felt the world pinch to a small circle. She threw herself over Eli and put her arms out like a poor shield. "Do not," she said, and there was so much in it that the man stalled. He had not counted on a woman who did not flinch. He had counted on noise and dust and people turning their heads while men did what men do. Huck came off the porch with a rifle held wrong and righted it as he ran. Mose pulled his own from the corner and chambered a shot with hands that were not steady and got steady. The yard filled with the mean sound of men remembering they were not alone. The rider with the pistol backed 2 steps. Smoke pushed into his face and made his next words die. He turned and ran for his horse with the others close to him. One of them dragged Red Rafe by his good arm boots, furrowing the dirt in lines that would stay a day. Wind came up out of nowhere and threw itself at the flames. Fire climbed the last length of the feed shed wall and dropped where the air ran out. The barn held. The boards nearest the blast blackened and then cooled to a look like old coffee. The hayloft breathed out smoke in tired puffs. Nora rolled off Eli and put her palm to the side of his face. Blood had run into his hair and made a dark road toward the ear. She dipped a rag in the trough and wrung it once and pressed it to the cut without waiting for permission. He bared his teeth and took a breath that came in 2 parts. "You keep still," she said. He opened his eyes and found her. His mouth tried a smile and did not manage it. "You are the bravest thing I have seen since war," he said. The words came soft as if they had to cross a long piece of country to reach the air. She kept the cloth steady until the blood slowed and the skin puffed under her hand. The water in the trough had a green smell. A horse came to drink and looked at them sidewise and then chose another place. Huck stood with the rifle against his thigh and stared at the place where Rafe had fallen. "I tied her rein wrong," Huck said to the yard. "I tied it wrong and she fixed it." No one answered him. The fire hissed and popped where soaked wood steamed. Tate Wickers had the ledger in his hands as if he could count what had been taken and found a balance for it. He shut the book without writing a line. Later, after the buckets had gone cold and the last ribbon of smoke left the roofline, Eli sat on the bunkhouse step with his head wrapped in a strip torn from a shirt. One eye had gone black around the edge like a bruise the sky might get. Nora brought clean water and a rag she had boiled and cooled. She wrung it and laid it along his temple. The skin there was hot and beat against her palm. He reached into his coat and took a chain from an inside pocket. It was silver worn down by years and held a small pendant shaped like a morning star. The points were smoothed by touch, and there was a scratch along one edge that had been polished into a shine. "My ma wore it at harvest," he said. "Said it kept her back strong when the fields gave up. It looks right on you." Nora felt the weight of the pendant in her palm. It was not heavy, but it had a truth to it. She lifted her hair and he fastened the chain at her nape. His fingers were careful. The star lay against her collarbone and took the light that still lived in the day. It warmed with her skin and stayed. She sat beside him and let the quiet place itself between them. The yard smelled of wet ash and horse. The men moved slow, softer in their speech. Huck picked up a scorch-blackened board and carried it like something that could bite. Mose stacked what hay was still good with a caution he did not always show. Nora's hand stung. When she opened them, she saw a line of blisters that had risen new and proud across the palm, a map of the fence she had set that morning, and the work the day had made of her. The handkerchief was no longer white where it had met her blood, but its thread held and its edges did not unravel. From the pasture came the soft sound of cattle settling. The aspen by the corral talked to one another with their little tongues of leaf. The sound was rain without water. The red scrap in Nora's pocket had dried stiff. The bent spur was a weight she felt when she moved. She imagined the place where it sat now at Jonah's board rowel turned like a thorn or a small sun, and felt the shape of that thought steady something in her that had been shaking. The sky gave up the heat by degrees. Light drew long across the yard and made a bright bar on the bunkhouse wall. Eli leaned forward and rested his forearms on his knees. "Tomorrow," Tate said near the cookhouse door to no one and to everyone. "We make a ledger of what stands." No one argued. The night did not yet belong to sleep. A horse blew through its nose and settled. The star at Nora's throat held the last warm of the day and made a small answer to the chill that would come. The storm carried itself in on a hush that felt like someone stepping into a room where no one had called for company. Heat left the yard in a rush. The aspen along the ditch shook themselves and finally made the sound of real rain. It came hard and straight, thick enough to blur the barn into a shape. Nora stood just inside the bunkhouse door and listened to voices in town that were not present but lived a walk away. Words could travel without feet. She packed with her hands, careful and fast. She took what she owned and what she had earned, the boiled rag she had used on Eli's head, the biscuit tin, the coil of rope that would drop true. She left the red scrap on the table and did not look at it again. She harnessed a bay mare to a canvas-topped wagon from the ranch yard. The mare shied from thunder, and then squared herself as if told what was expected. Nora threw her shawl over her hair and climbed onto the seat. The morning star lay cold on her throat and then warmed as she breathed. The road carried water that ran without choosing a side. Her boots took a beating. She set the reins and let the mare find a pace that would not break them both. The rain hit the canvas overhead like 1,000 small hands. The sound filled the world and made thinking difficult in a way that helped. She reached the split east of the river. The cottonwoods there bent in the wind and threw water off their leaves. A rider stood in the fork where the road turned. Eli faced her hat gone hair-plastered to his skull. Water ran off the brim line his hat would have drawn. His coat was open and hung heavy. He sat easy, but his horse was not the point. "I am not here to argue," Nora said. She made her voice clear so the rain would not take it. "Move." Eli did not move. He took the reins in one hand and let the other rest on his thigh. He had ridden hard. Breath lifted his chest and fell slow. "You do not leave the one place where dust feels like home," he said. Nora kept her hands on the reins. The mare shook her head and blew. Water ran off the wagon cover in sheets. "You heard what they said," she said. "You were standing there to hear it." "I heard what everyone says," he said. "I listened to you." He reached inside his coat and fought wet cloth to bring out a square of white. The handkerchief had taken on the day and gone gray at the edges. The corner still read RH in small, careful letters. The cloth hung heavy with rain, but held its shape. "I kept this from the creek day," he said. "I thought I would hand it back when I knew you were not running." Nora slid from the seat. The ground took her weight and sucked at her boots. Rain found her collar and ran down her spine. She walked to him. He looked rough and alive. A cut above his eye had not healed clean, and the rain brought the color out of it. She set her palm with the cloth against his chest and felt the beat of him under wet wool. It came like a hammer that had found its work. Her hand shook with cold and something else. "I do not know how to stay," she said. That was the whole of it. She had built walls that had no corners. She had slept light and stored her weight in her feet. Staying was a thing she had not learned. "You do not have to know it," he said. "Just do not go." They stood in rain that fell as if the sky had cracked and never would mend. Water pulled off his jaw in lines. The horse lowered its head and blinked. The mare stood. Nora did not step back. The handkerchief warmed slowly between palm and coat. The morning star tapped once on her collarbone and went still. The storm broke. It passed like a train that had made its noise and went on. The air behind it was thin and new. The roads held puddles and shone. the aspen glittered, and then decided they had done enough. Word came on foot before the smoke did. A boy with no hat ran past the yard with his mouth open and no sound. Sheriff Pike came behind him at a walk that was faster than walking. The church bell clanged wrong and jumped on its rope. Eli and Nora turned without speaking and put their horses to a trot. Adobe Springs met them with a sky that had found an orange it did not usually wear. The old mission chapel stood at the end of the street with a fire working up its underbelly. Flame ran along the eaves as if finding home. The bell rope jerked and threw sound like a panicking animal. Water ran in the gutters from the storm and did nothing the fire cared to notice. The air held the pepper of smoke and the fat of burning oil. Men formed a line with buckets that did not stay full by the time they reached the wall. The wind had not made up its mind and kept changing sides. Sparks rode it and fell on awnings and coats and hair. Women pulled children close and said the names of saints without hearing themselves. Nora heard a cry folded inside the larger noise. It was thin and high and full of work. It came from the chapel doorway where smoke had turned to a curtain. She saw the shape of a small body under a fallen beam, eyes open and wild. She did not think. She ran through the door where heat tried to push her back. The air bit in a way that was nothing like cold. It bit and kept biting deeper. The hem of her skirt took a lick of fire and showed orange at the edge of her vision. She beat it with her hand without looking. The floor had thrown up splinters like a field throws stones. The beam was heavy enough to be a grown man. She slid her hands under, and the wood burned her in places she would not see until later. The boy fixed on her face and did not move. He had a smudge across his nose that would not wash easy. She lifted, and the beam held to something, and then let go with a sound like a tooth coming free. She pulled him out by the shirt, and he came small and hot. Smoke made the world a circle. Nora coughed and tasted coins. The doorway stood full of light. The handkerchief rode her wrist bone under soot. She rapped it once and slapped at a cinder that had set her sleeve to smolder. The cloth blackened and held. Eli was there at the door. He had left his horse tied to nothing. He reached in and took the boy under the arms and set him aside where hands could grab him and carry him to the trough. Nora came out after on knees and hands that did not care what they took. Air dropped into her and found a way. The square fell quiet, the kind of quiet that falls when a beast has passed and folks look to see which houses still stand. Fire chewed what it had left of the roof and then chose the sky. The bell rope broke. The bell gave one small knock against itself and would not try again. Eli crossed the ash like a man who had set his boots to do it, and knelt in front of Nora before the crowd had a thought formed. He looked up at her, not through her, and his eyes were not wet, only clear. He set his hands where he could, and did not grab. "You are not too much," he said. "You are enough for me." The words went as far as they had to, and sat down. The people in the square had their mouths half open, and then closed them. Sheriff Pike took his hat off and did not put it back on. The boy coughed from the trough and then cried with a noise that belonged to the living. Women drew breath and made use of it. Della Moore stepped out from the rope of bodies and came to stand beside Nora. Her hand shook in the space between them and then found Nora's shoulder. Her palm was warm and dry and steady. "I was a widow once," she said. "I did not carry it the way you do." Nora looked at her and saw a line of years in the woman's face that did not beg for anyone's pity. The touch did not ask either. It landed and stayed. Nora set a hand on the child's back and felt the small lungs work. Soot had turned her hair darker and stuck it to her cheeks. The morning star had gone dull with ash. Eli stood and did not step away. He kept his place half a pace at her side where a man would be if he meant it. Huck came to the line of the square and stopped with the look of someone who wanted to ask, and would not. Mose took his hat off and looked at the ground and then at Nora, and managed a small nod that had something like apology in it. Wind changed. It pushed smoke into Main Street and then drew it off toward the flats. A strip of red cloth wandered down the gutter in water that had not found a place to sit. It caught on a nail at the curb and worked itself free. It went on without looking back. The chapel burned itself out in a pattern that left the front steps and the stone that had held the door. The door had gone like a voice used up. Sheriff Pike walked up and put his hand to the stone and then pulled it away because the heat was still there hidden. Someone brought blankets. Someone brought water. The bucket line stood with arms that did not yet know they could rest. Nora shifted the boy in her arms and found he had gone from stiff to heavy. She set him on his feet and held a cup to his mouth. He drank and coughed and drank again. Her palms sang with a pain that had finally found words. She looked down and saw blisters raised like small moons. The handkerchief was black along one edge, and the letters RH stayed where they had been stitched. Eli touched the small of her back once. Not a claim, a point of reference. The square held them, and the people in it held their own thoughts for the moment and did not spend them out loud. The sky showed a clean blue behind the smoke where the day went on. The aspen at the edge of the square shivered and made their quiet sound as if remembering rain. Smoke thinned over Adobe Springs until it was only a taste on the back of the tongue. Folks drifted home with wet hems and black hands. The boy Nora had carried slept heavy on a bench, one arm flung over his eyes. Della tucked a blanket around him and nodded to Nora as if passing a weight from one set of shoulders to another. The morning star lay soot dull against Nora's skin. She wiped it once with the edge of the handkerchief and brought back a gray smear that would not quit. Eli looked to her face and then to her palms where blisters had settled high and round. He did not reach for them. He took the red strip that had wandered the gutter and set it on the lip of a rain barrel. The cloth bled color into the water and turned it faintly pink. He said nothing. He watched the dye fade. They rode out while the streets were still wet. The land shone in patches where puddles had taken hold. The ranch stretched in its usual quiet, a thing made of fences and animals and habit. The feed shed sat black along one wall. The rest of the yard stood intact, stubborn as a mule. Briggs Hollow, Nora said, and the name came with a breath that wanted a change. Eli tied down the last loose board at the barn and looked toward the notch where the hollow lay. The old place had sat empty windows, like eyes gone dull porch slumped fields pulled under by weeds that kept their own counsel. They took a wagon and a day. Huck drove nails until his hands shook and then found a better way to stand. Mose lifted more than he had to and set each beam as if the house might teach him a new patience. Tate Wickers arrived with rope, 2 saws, and a face that said he would rather be useful than correct. Sheriff Pike lent his hammer and did not speak of the chapel. Grass clawed at the skirts of the yard. Eli walked the line and cut it back with swings that landed true. Nora scrubbed the floors until they showed the lines of the boards again and took light like a pond take sky. The smell of sap and soap got into everything and made the day feel clean. She found the bent spur where she had set it at Jonah's marker and brought it to the new threshold. Eli hung it beside the door, Rowell turned like a small sun. Next to it he placed the juniper bird. He had finished the wings with an edge of his knife-patient cuts until the wood suggested flight. The two sat there together, iron and wood, the one dark and stubborn, the other pale and light. "What do you call a house that remembers to bloom?" Nora asked. She stood with her palm flat to the door she had scrubbed. "Columbine House," Eli said. She smiled without showing teeth. The word fit. The first Columbine of the season had found a crack in the east step and lifted its blue, clean face. The leaves of the aspen along the draw moved and gave their quiet music. For the first time since Nora came to Arrow Bend, the sound matched water sitting inside the ground. Word traveled the way it does when a thing takes root. A girl with a braid cut square at the ends stood at the fence with her small fists up on the top rail. Her aunt had died when the cough took half the street near the brickyard. No other kin came. The girl watched the door and did not blink as if a blink might make it vanish. Nora swung the gate open and came to her with hands that were not gentle or rough. The girl breathed. She passed inside the gate as if stepping onto a boat. By the end of the week, 2 boys appeared, brothers who had run their mouths mean since their father did not come back from a winter drive. They fought each other by habit and looked ashamed when they stopped. Mose taught them to stack wood in a way that did not come down and kept them busy until their eyes went soft. Huck sat on the porch steps at night with a small knife and cut leather to shape. He did not apologize with words. He slid thin pads into the tongues of the children's boots and laced them snug. The stitches were small and tidy. He did not look up when Nora said thank you. Della Moore came with quilts pieced from shirts that had seen too much and still felt like home. She brought cards with letters on them, old school things that had learned many hands. She traced the letter A with a finger and watched a small boy follow. His mouth moved and no sound came out. She kissed the top of his head as if that would help the sound find a way. Eli taught them to ride the gentle mare that had pulled the wagon. He started with a hand on the withers and a voice low. He showed how a neck rein speaks without taking. He whistled the single sharp note that brings a horse from a long field. The smaller children found the whistle first. The sound came thin at the start, then true. Nora lit a fire in the kitchen and kept a pot on that never quite emptied. Beans, salt pork, corn when it could be spared. The smell moved out the windows and called to the yard. The children learned where to set plates and where to wash them. She set them to chores, not hard, not light. She did not ask for gratitude. She put a hand to a small back when it seemed needed and took it away when it was not. One afternoon, a man with a notebook and a hat too neat for this country came up the track from town. He had written Austin on the inside band as if it could go missing from his head. He asked if this was the place with the children. He looked surprised to find it was also the place with clean floors. Eli sat on the porch step with the juniper bird in his palm. He cut a little more where a wing met the back. The knife was small and sharp. He set a curl of pale wood on his knee with the rest. Mind if I ask? The man started, then stopped because Eli was not a man anyone interrupted easily. Why her, he said. Of all the women, why Nora Briggs? Eli looked out past the yard to where the Columbine lifted in their blue and white boats. Nora had taken off her shawl and chased the smallest boy between rows of corn that were not yet taller than a hand. She kept her gait easy, so his little steps would have something to chase. Where some saw a widow, Eli said, I saw a wildfire. The man wrote that down. He stared as if the words had spoken themselves, and he had only been tasked with catching them. He asked a few more things, and then tipped his hat to Nora, and walked away with his notebook held like a small plate. Evening laid itself over Columbine House like a cloth. Children settled in nests pulled together from quilts and pillows. Someone had left a small toy horse on the stair carved from pine unfinished. Nora found it and set it on her pillow, then took it back to the child who had fallen asleep making it. The morning star flashed once in the lamplight and then went quiet. Eli came in from the yard with dirt on his hands and shot a look at the door as if listening for company that would not be welcome. He reached to the mantel and took the red scrap they had saved from the barrel. He held it to the lamp chimney until the cloth caught and turned from red to black to nothing. Ash lifted and took the shape of breath before it went. He opened the window and let the thin smoke go with the night air. No one said anything. Everyone saw it. On Sunday, the children stood under the aspen and read letters off cards. Their voices made a line of sound, thin and real. Della nodded along as if to a tune. The aspens answered with their own tongues, and the sound gave back a memory of rain. A hawk crossed high and threw a shadow that touched and moved on. The boys who used to fight learned to tie a square knot without looking. The girl with the square braid sat with Nora at the table and copied her name onto brown paper. She pressed too hard, broke the pencil point, and laughed without asking permission first. Huck brought a tin of peppermint and passed it to Eli as if returning a tool. Eli shook out 2 pieces and kept one for his pocket. In town, folks said what they said. They also sent sacks of flour that were larger than the ones they kept and did not leave a name. Sheriff Pike set a new bell rope at the chapel and did not talk while he worked. He looked over at Columbine House once and tipped his head in the way men do when they see a thing standing that was not standing before. Nora woke before the sun and watched the light catch on the aspen leaves until they glowed. She stepped out with bare feet and set her toes on the cool of the stoop. The ground gave a little. Eli joined her with 2 cups that steamed. They stood without speaking. 2 sets of prints ran side by side from the door to the yard and back. Each pass made them clearer. She touched the bird on the wall wood warm from the day. She touched the spur iron cool from the night. The house took those touches and kept them. The field beyond had gone blue in waves. Columbine spread to the fence and knocked at it lightly. Children burst from the doorway with mouths full of morning and ran for the flowers. A small boy stopped to pet the mare's nose. The animal breathed over his hand and let him. Eli set the cups on the step. He took a breath that filled his lungs instead of scratching at them. Nora lifted the morning star where it lay. It caught light soft as a held word. They walked down into the yard together. Their steps made a path in dirt that would stay until the next rain and then make itself again. The sound of leaves and small voices knit with the quiet inside the ground. The day opened its hands. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. If this story resonated with you or made you reflect, I'd love to hear your thoughts, so feel free to share them in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you won't miss the next story.